Two men held the office of President of the United States within 30 years of each other, and both descended from the same Dutch farmer who stepped off a ship onto Manhattan Island in the 1640s. Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt shared a surname that began as a plain description of farmland carried by a man named Claes Martensen van Rosenvelt, and it is only one of a small cluster of Dutch names that still run through the deepest layers of New York's founding families. Long before New York was English, it was New Amsterdam, a fur trading outpost of the Dutch West India Company clinging to the tip of Manhattan Island. The men and women who built it were merchants, soldiers, farmhands, and ministers, most of them ordinary, a handful of them extraordinarily wealthy, and their names did not disappear when the English arrived in 1664. They survived, folded into an American language that no longer remembered where the words had come from. Van Rensselaer, Stuyvesant, Van Cortlandt, Schuyler, Van Buren, Bogardus, Beekman, Rutgers, Vanderbilt, Wyckoff, Ten Eyck, Kip, Bleecker, Remsen, and Roosevelt. 15 names that built the physical and civic bones of New York, and that may be sitting, right now, somewhere inside your own family tree. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Dutch West India Company chartered New Amsterdam in 1625. On a marshy island the Lenape people knew by a different name entirely, and the settlement functioned less like a colony and more like a company outpost built to move beaver pelts across the Atlantic. Traditional accounts describe the island's purchase from Lenape representatives for goods valued at roughly 60 guilders, a story that has been repeated for centuries and shaped by decades of retelling into something closer to legend than transaction record. What the company's own ledgers make clear is that New Amsterdam grew slowly and unevenly, a garrison town of wooden houses and muddy lanes, governed first by Willem Kieft and later by a one-legged former soldier named Petrus Stuyvesant, whose name still marks a neighborhood on the very island he once ruled. To attract settlers willing to leave the Netherlands for an uncertain colony an ocean away, the company offered enormous land grants to wealthy investors known as patroons, men who agreed to bring at least 50 colonists to New Netherland in exchange for near total authority over vast tracts along the Hudson River. Below the patroons sat a different kind of settler, and it is here that most family trees actually connect to New Netherland. Indentured farmhands, soldiers finishing out their company contracts, artisans, and widows who remarried quickly out of necessity made up the bulk of the population, and their naming conventions looked nothing like the fixed surnames Americans use now. Many carried patronymics, names built from the father's first name plus a suffix meaning son or daughter, so a man named Jan, whose father was named Ert, might be recorded as Jan Ertsen, Jan son of Ert, with no guarantee his own children would carry the same name forward. That system worked well enough inside a small Dutch-speaking settlement where everyone already knew whose son was whose. It would not survive what came next. The word van itself, meaning of or from, carried a small but real social weight in the colony, and it did not attach itself evenly to every family. Wealthier merchants and landholders tended to keep it fixed to a place name, Van Rensselaer, Van Cortlandt, marking a family's origin or estate the way a European surname might. Ordinary farmhands and laborers were far less consistent about it, and many descendants of the same immigrant ended up on opposite sides of that small linguistic line, one branch keeping the van and another dropping it within a generation or two, for no clearer reason than which town clerk happened to be writing the record down that day. Petrus Stuyvesant arrived in New Amsterdam in 1647 as the company's fourth director general, a rigid, hot-tempered administrator who had lost part of a leg fighting the Spanish in the Caribbean and wore a silver-banded wooden replacement for the rest of his life. He tightened the colony's laws, expanded its defensive wall along what is now Wall Street, and governed with an authority that made him unpopular among the merchants he ruled. When 4 English warships appeared in New York Harbor in the late summer of 1664, Stuyvesant wanted to fight. The colony's own council refused to back him, and he surrendered New Amsterdam without a shot fired, watching his life's work renamed New York for the Duke of York within days. He stayed. He bought a farm on the eastern edge of Manhattan, in an area still called the Bowery, a Dutch word for farm, and he is buried beneath a church built on land that was once his own. Stuyvesant's government leaned heavily on the Dutch Reformed Church for more than religious life. The colony had no separate civil office recording births, so a baptismal entry in the church's own register doubled as the closest thing the colony kept to a birth certificate, and a marriage recorded by the church's minister was the only marriage the colony's courts would recognize as valid. That overlap between faith and paperwork is exactly why so many of these 15 families remain traceable today. The church did not merely bless a family's arrival in the world, it filed it. Kilian van Rensselaer's patroonship outlived nearly every other Dutch institution in America, in a form that grew stranger with each passing generation. He was a diamond and pearl merchant in Amsterdam who never once set foot in the colony that bore his family's name, running his estate of Rensselaerswyck entirely through agents and correspondence, and his descendants would go on to control roughly 1 million acres around what is now Albany. Rensselaerswyck survived the English takeover, survived the Revolution, and continued operating under something close to its original leasehold structure until 1839, when tenant farmers across the old patroonship rose up against rents some of their families had been paying since the 1630s, a period of unrest remembered as the Anti-Rent War. Stephen van Rensselaer III, known during his lifetime as the last patroon, died that same year still holding land under a system that predated the United States itself, and the legal fight his death triggered over unpaid back rents ran through New York courts for more than a decade afterward. The Roosevelt line traces to that same Claes Martensen van Roosevelt, who arrived in New Amsterdam sometime in the 1640s, and whose descendants split into two branches within a few generations, one settling on Long Island around Oyster Bay, the other moving up the Hudson to Dutchess County near Hyde Park. Those two branches grew apart for more than 2 centuries, distant enough that Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were only fifth cousins by the time both reached the White House, one a Republican from the Oyster Bay branch, the other a Democrat from Hyde Park. The surname itself, Van Roosevelt, meant of the Rose Field, almost certainly describing land the family farmed rather than any claim to standing, and it is a reminder that most of these Dutch names began as descriptions of dirt, water, and work. Olaf Stevens van Cortlandt came to New Amsterdam as a company soldier in the late 1630s, and by the time he died he had become one of the wealthiest merchants and brewers in the colony, serving multiple terms as a magistrate under both Dutch and, later, English rule. His descendants built a manor house north of the city that still stands today inside the park that carries the family name Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, and the family's continued prominence under English governance is worth sitting with. Wealth and administrative usefulness could carry a Dutch name through the transition of 1664 largely intact, while a farmhand carrying the same surname and no such standing had a far harder road ahead. The Schuyler family rose to its greatest prominence a full century after New Amsterdam fell, when Philip Schuyler served as a major general in the Continental Army and later as one of New York's first United States senators. His daughter Elizabeth married Alexander Hamilton in the family's mansion in Albany, tying the old Dutch patrician class directly into a federal government the Dutch colonists never lived to see. The Schuyler name descends from an early settler named Philip Peterson Schuyler, who arrived in the Albany area in the 1650s, and the family's continuous documentation across 2 centuries, wills, land patents, church records, military commissions, makes it one of the more thoroughly traceable lines on this list. Everardus Bogardus served as the second minister of the Dutch Reformed congregation in New Amsterdam and married a wealthy widow named Anneke Jans, whose earlier landholdings on Lower Manhattan became the subject of legal disputes that dragged through American courts for more than 2 centuries after her death. Bogardus himself drowned in a shipwreck off the coast of Wales in 1647, while sailing back to the Netherlands to answer for a bitter feud with Governor Kieft. Anneke Jans' original farmland, granted to her before she ever married Bogardus, later passed through her heirs into the hands of Trinity Church, and the question of whether every rightful heir had actually signed away their claim to it became a recurring lawsuit that resurfaced in American courts well into the 1800s, brought each time by a new set of descendants, convinced the church held land that was still, by rights, theirs. His descendants through Anneke Jans number in the tens of thousands today, spread across a genealogical web wide enough that the Holland Society still fields inquiries from people trying to confirm or rule out a connection to her. Wilhelmus Beekman crossed the Atlantic with Stuyvesant's household in 1647 and built a career as a merchant, alderman, and eventually acting governor of the colony under Dutch rule, before serving again in city government once the English took over. His descendants held property along the East River for generations, and 2 Manhattan streets, Beekman Street downtown and Beekman Place farther north, still sit where the family's land once was. The Beekman name is a useful example of something true across most of this list. Streets, parks, and place names across New York function as a second genealogical record, written not in a church register but into the city's own geography. Harmon Rutgers ran a brewery in New Amsterdam and left behind a family whose name would eventually attach itself to an entire university, though not through him directly. It was his descendant, Colonel Henry Rutgers, a Revolutionary War veteran and philanthropist who donated funds and a bell to a struggling college in New Jersey, whose name the trustees chose to honor by renaming the institution Rutgers College in 1825. The brewer's family name survived 4 generations of Dutch and English rule to end up carved over the entrance of one of the country's oldest universities, a fact most students who walk beneath it never learn. Coenraad ten Eyck settled in the Albany area in the 1650s and became one of a small cluster of families, alongside the Schuylers and the Van Rensselaers, who effectively ran the upriver fur trade for the rest of the 17th century. The Ten Eyck name appears again and again in early Albany's court records, church consistory minutes, and militia rosters, the kind of repetitive, unglamorous documentation that genealogists actually prize far more than a single dramatic mention. A name that shows up 40 times across 40 years of mundane civic paperwork is, in its own quiet way, better evidence of a real, continuous family presence than any single celebrated appearance could ever be. Hendrik Hendrickson Kip arrived in New Amsterdam in the 1630s and acquired a large farm along the East River shoreline, land that stayed in Kip family hands long enough that the cove beside it became known simply as Kip's Bay. That name outlived the family's direct ownership by more than a century. British forces landed at Kip's Bay in September of 1776 during the campaign for Long Island, a detail most people who now live or work in that stretch of Manhattan have no reason to know, since the farmland sits buried under more than 2 centuries of city built on top of city. Martin Van Buren was born in the village of Kinderhook, north of Albany, in 1782, into a Dutch-speaking household so thoroughly Dutch that English was, by his own account, a second language he acquired mainly through schooling and public life. He became the 8th President of the United States, the first president born after the country's independence, and the only president whose first language was not English. His ancestors trace back to an early Hudson Valley settler, and the persistence of spoken Dutch in his household nearly 2 centuries after New Amsterdam fell says something the surname records alone cannot. Language lingered in pockets of the Hudson Valley long after the colony's flag had changed, carried in kitchens and churches even as it disappeared everywhere else. Look at the shape these 11 names have taken so far. A patroon who never crossed the ocean, a one-legged governor who surrendered without firing a shot and never left, a minister who drowned before he could answer for a feud, a brewer whose descendant funded a university, a president raised speaking a language his own country had already stopped using at home. Almost none of it fits the picture most Americans carry of the country's founding families, a picture that tends to run entirely English and center almost entirely on Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. New Amsterdam predates the Mayflower's landing by roughly a year, and its Dutch families built the physical footprint that Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs still sit on top of today, street by street, park by park, in names most residents pass without a second look. The remaining 4 names on this list carry that pattern forward, from an indentured farmhand who built the oldest surviving house in New York City to a shipping fortune that started with a rowboat. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Jan Artsen Vanderbilt arrived in New Netherland around 1650 as an indentured farm laborer from a small town called De Bilt, and the surname simply described where he came from, Vanderbilt of the Bilt. He worked out his indenture and became a modest farmer on Staten Island, and for 4 generations his descendants stayed modest farmers, unremarkable in every surviving record. Then, in 1794, a boy named Cornelius was born into that same family, and Cornelius Vanderbilt spent his childhood ferrying passengers and cargo around New York Harbor in a small boat, before building, over the following 7 decades, the largest private fortune in the United States, through steamships and then railroads. By the time he died in 1877, the family that once could not afford anything beyond a Staten Island farm controlled more capital than the United States Treasury held in reserve. The surname never changed. The distance between what it started as and what it became is the entire story. Peter Clayson Wyckoff came to New Netherland around 1637 as an indentured farmhand working directly for the Dutch West India Company, and after years of labor he earned his freedom and acquired land in what is now the Flatlands section of Brooklyn. Around 1652 he built a small farmhouse there, and that house is still standing. The Peter Clayson Wyckoff House is recognized today as the oldest surviving structure in New York City, a National Historic Landmark that has outlasted the Dutch colony, the English colony, the American Revolution, and nearly 4 centuries of a city rebuilding itself around it. Peter Clayson Wyckoff is also documented as the ancestor of an unusually large number of living descendants, enough that the Wyckoff House Association still tracks the family's genealogy actively, and enough that genealogists consider the Wyckoff line one of the most thoroughly mapped Dutch bloodlines in all of New Netherlands' surviving records. Few families anywhere in the country can point to a single standing structure that connects an indentured laborer's first years of freedom directly to a living descendant 4 centuries later. Jan Jansen Bleecker settled first in Albany, where he served multiple terms as mayor in the late 1600s, and his descendants later acquired farmland in Lower Manhattan that the family began selling off as the city expanded northward in the early 1800s. The street cut through that former farmland still carries the family name today, Bleecker Street, now one of the most recognized addresses in Greenwich Village, its Dutch origin invisible to the millions of people who have walked it without ever wondering where the name came from. The Remsen family descends from a patronymic Rem Jansen, son of Jan, whose own children eventually fixed the surname Remsen as their permanent family name. One small example of the broader shift away from patronymics that swept through nearly every Dutch family in New Netherland within 2 generations of the English takeover. The Remsens settled primarily in Brooklyn and Queens, becoming farmers, millers, and later civic officials, and Remsen Street in Brooklyn Heights still traces a portion of the family's original landholding. Of all 15 names on this list, Remsen offers the clearest window into how a Dutch naming system became the fixed American surname so many families carry today, whether they know the mechanism behind it or not. The mechanism that turned these families from a small Dutch-speaking colony into ordinary early Americans did not arrive as an edict banning the Dutch language or seizing Dutch property outright. Surrender terms signed in 1664 allowed Dutch colonists to keep their land, their religion, and their local customs. And by the standards of 17th century conquest, those terms were unusually generous. What changed instead was slower, and in its way more thorough. English became the language of courts, of land deeds, of provincial government, and every family that wanted to protect its property, resolve an inheritance dispute, or hold civic office within a generation or two needed to operate inside that English language system whether it wanted to or not. Part of that pressure had a name and a date. The English governor Richard Nichols issued a legal code in 1665 known as the Duke's Laws, establishing English common law, English courts, and English land tenure across the newly renamed province of New York. Dutch residents were permitted to keep property acquired under Dutch rule, but any new transaction, any new will, any new deed from that point forward ran through an English legal system that had no built-in place for a name that changed every generation. The patronymic naming system was among the first casualties. English courts and clerks needed a fixed surname to track a deed or a will across multiple transactions and multiple generations, something a patronymic could never reliably provide, since a Jansen in one generation might be a Peterson in the next. Dutch families across New York and New Jersey responded over the following decades by locking their names in place, choosing an occupation, a hometown, a father's name, or a feature of the land, and fixing it permanently as a hereditary surname the way English families already did. That is the quiet administrative pressure sitting behind nearly every name on this list. Vanderbilt of the Bilt, Van Roosevelt of the Rosefield, Ten Eyck at the Oak. A court clerk needed something to write down twice in a row and have it mean the same family both times, and that practical requirement decided most of these surnames, long before anyone thought of them as old New York names worth remembering. Pronunciation and spelling drifted next, and it drifted for a full century without anyone deciding it should. Van Roosevelt softened into Roosevelt somewhere across the 1700s. Vanderbilt fused into the single word Vanderbilt. Church records from the same family, kept by the same Dutch Reformed congregations, sometimes spell a surname 3 different ways across 3 different decades. 3 different families did not exist. An English-speaking clerk was doing his best with a name he had never learned to write, and spelling itself would not settle into anything consistent for another 100 years. Language followed the same slow drift. Dutch held on longest inside the Dutch Reformed Church, where services in some rural Hudson Valley congregations continued at least partly in Dutch well into the middle of the 1700s, and inside households like Martin Van Buren's, where a boy born after the Revolutionary War still grew up hearing it as his first language. By the time his own children were raised, that was no longer true anywhere nearby. The language did not survive the family that had carried it fastest. What survives instead sits inside records that most descendants never think to open. The Dutch Reformed Church kept detailed baptismal and marriage registers throughout the colonial period, written in Dutch, and for close to 3 centuries those records sat largely untranslated, accessible mainly to scholars who could read 17th century Dutch handwriting. That changed through a sustained translation effort based at the New York State Archives, where researchers have spent decades working through roughly 12,000 pages of surviving Dutch colonial documents, land patents, court minutes, correspondence, and church registers, rendering them into English for the first time since they were written. A family searching for a Van Cortlandt or a Ten Eyck ancestor today can, for the first time in the record's history, actually read what the original clerk wrote, rather than relying on a second-hand summary or a family story passed down without documentation behind it. That translation project has taken decades precisely because 17th century Dutch legal and church handwriting is its own specialized skill, closer to reading a different script than reading an older version of a familiar language. A single page can take a trained translator the better part of a day to render accurately, and the documents cover everything from a farmer's minor property dispute to the official correspondence between the colony's directors and the company's board back in Amsterdam. What emerges from that slow work is not a single dramatic discovery, but a steady accumulation of small, verifiable facts, exactly the kind of evidence a family tree is actually built from. The Holland Society of New York, founded in 1885, exists specifically to verify these lines, and its membership requirement is exact. An applicant must document direct male line descent from someone who lived in New Netherland before 1675, supported by primary sources at every generation, not family tradition. That standard has turned away more applicants over the decades than it has accepted, and it exists precisely because so many families in the New York area carry a story about Dutch ancestry that sounds plausible, and once the paperwork is actually traced, leads somewhere else entirely. A surname like Van Buren or Bogardus spread widely enough across 4 centuries that plenty of families carrying it today have no documented line back to New Netherland at all, and the Society's records are one of the few places built specifically to tell the difference between a name that was inherited and a name that was simply admired. Genetic genealogy has added a newer layer to this verification work over the past 2 decades, though it works alongside the paper record rather than replacing it. Several of these families, including Van Rensselaer and Roosevelt descendants, have taken part in surname-based Y-DNA projects hosted through commercial genealogy testing services, where men carrying the same surname compare their direct paternal line markers against each other to see whether they share a common ancestor within a genealogically relevant time frame. A match does not identify which specific 17th century ancestor 2 men share. It can confirm or occasionally disprove that 2 branches of a surname line actually descend from the same immigrant, rather than from 2 unrelated men who happen to end up with the same name generations apart, which did happen more often than most descendants assume, particularly with common patronymic-derived surnames like Jansen or Peterson that many unrelated Dutch families adopted independently once fixed surnames became necessary. For a name like Wyckoff or Ten Eyck, where the documented paper trail already runs continuously back to a single founding immigrant, a Y-DNA match mostly confirms what the church registers already showed. For a more scattered name, it can be the only tool available to sort a real line from a coincidental one. Walk through Lower Manhattan today, and the Dutch families never really left, even if almost nobody living there now carries the surnames or speaks the language. The Bowery was once Stuyvesant's own farmland. Wall Street sits where his defensive wall used to stand. Beekman Street and Beekman Place trace a merchant family's old East River holdings. Bleecker Street cuts through what was once Bleecker farmland. Kips Bay remembers a family that sold off its shoreline generations before the neighborhood took its current shape. Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx sits on the family's old manor grounds, and Rensselaerswyck's former boundaries still roughly outline the counties surrounding Albany. None of these names required a monument or a museum to survive. They survived because a city kept using them for its own streets and neighborhoods long after the families themselves scattered into the general population. None of this required any of these families to have done anything especially dramatic. Most of them did not. Most Dutch settlers in New Netherland lived and died as farmers, brewers, and tradespeople whose names never appeared anywhere near a treaty or a battlefield, and whose descendants today have no idea a Van Cortlandt or a Beekman sits somewhere in a grandparent's family Bible. The families singled out here stand out mainly because enough of their paperwork survived intact for 4 centuries to be traced clearly, not because they mattered more than their neighbors did at the time. The people carrying these 15 surnames today number in the hundreds of thousands, spread across every state and well beyond New York, most of them several dozen generations removed from anyone who actually spoke Dutch or attended a service at the original Reformed Church on Manhattan. A shared surname with Vanderbilt does not make anyone an heir to a shipping fortune scattered generations ago among dozens of descendants. A shared surname with Roosevelt does not connect anyone automatically to either president, since the Oyster Bay and Hyde Park branches were already distant cousins by the time both reached national politics, and other Roosevelt lines exist entirely apart from either of them. What a shared surname offers instead is a starting point, not a conclusion. A name worth tracing through the baptismal registers, the land patents, and the Holland Society's exacting standards, rather than a name worth simply claiming. Somewhere in Dutchess County, in a family plot that has held Roosevelt since before the Revolution, and somewhere on Oyster Bay's North Shore, in a different family plot belonging to the same distant bloodline, the descendants of Claes Martensen van Roosevelt are buried a few dozen miles apart, closer to each other in the ground than either branch ever was in life. Between them sit 14 other names: a patroon's estate, a governor's farm, a minister's drowned body, a brewer's university, a farmhand's fortune, a farmhand's house, still standing after nearly 4 centuries, a president who thought in Dutch before he thought in English. New Amsterdam lasted only 40 years as a Dutch colony, before the English flag went up over the fort. What it built in those 40 years, in names, in land, in a handful of church registers written in a language most of its own descendants can no longer read, has lasted nearly 400. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.